Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Tobias Haque, who's a development professional and economist, currently serving as the World Bank's lead country economist for Pakistan. And we're recording this podcast on January 26th, but by the time this goes out, elections would have happened in Pakistan. We hopefully, by the time you're listening or watching this, there will be a new cabinet in place. There will be a new finance minister in place. At least that's the assumption. February 8th is the election. So by the time we're live on YouTube and Spotify and everywhere else, so probably 5 more days would have passed. And we hope, I think Tobias would agree with me, that there is important by that time to have a cabinet in place. But we'll talk about that as well. But really, the goal for this conversation, right, is to hear about what is likely to be the reforms or should be the reforms agenda in Pakistan. We'll talk about the World Bank's work in Pakistan, what it has been pushing for, where it has had success, where it still hopes there would be more success. And that is also linked to some of the changes we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, in terms of the outreach the bank has been doing with people on policy and reforms agenda and recommendations. So we'll talk about all of that. But Tobias, thank you so much for taking out the time today, and such a pleasure to finally have you on the podcast.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Susan.
I want to begin with sort of the wish list, right? So, from the research you have done, the bank has done, the conversations you all have had in Islamabad and across Pakistan, and your vantage point, right? You've looked at other countries around the world as well. What are some of the big picture things? Again, I wouldn't say in the next 5 years. We never know. In Pakistan, it's tough to sort of know what the environment will be like in the next 5 months, let alone the next 5 years. But if we were to say February, new government here, 10 more months to go for the year, what would you like to see happen in that period of time that makes you think, you know what, this time is different for the better?
No, look, it's. I think the key point you're making there is that it's time to do something different, right? It looks like we're going to be heading into 25th IMF program. We're in a place where the economy has been growing at lower than the pace of population growth for a few years now. So people are per capita income's actually declining. We've got a situation in which average growth rate for Pakistan over the past 20 years has been about 2%, 1.7%, versus the South Asia region average of about 4%. If you look at the long-term trends, Pakistan basically has moved from being one of the top performers in the region to being second lowest last time I looked in terms of per capita GDP. And that's not just numbers, right? I mean, this kind of manifests in the lived experience of Pakistanis and the opportunities that they face. We've got a 40% child stunting rate now. We've got the largest number of kids out of school of any country in the world, 20 million. Huge problems with employment and the poverty rate going up, right? So whatever is happening in Pakistan right now, it's not working. And that, I think, is the core message we as the World Bank have been trying to get across over the past months and honestly longer than that. And I think this is the point. These elections represent a bit of a potential critical juncture, right? It's elections always, they give you a bit of a blank slate. And what we've seen in many countries around the world is when a new government comes in, they have a bit of scope to do things differently, to make a break from the past. And I think that really is the hope here. This is the hope that we're going to see a change in economic direction, a change in the policy settings, and that the appetite for change that we have, the urgency of change that we have, with a new IMF program presumably being negotiated, will create that space. So to your question, I mean, like, what should that look like? I think the first point is that any new government we would like to see really take ownership of the reform program, right? So I think we've been in a pattern for a long time where the government has been trying to do almost the least amount possible and has been forced into concessions almost by the IMF, by international partners, Whereas it would be great to see a new government come in and really move on to the front foot to say, look, here is our reform program, and we want you as international partners to support it. And I think internationally, that's when you get real change. No government really ever achieves real sustainable growth, real sustainable step changes in economic performance unless they own a reform program. So I think step one, right, is for the government to actually think, what does it want the economy to look like? What steps would need to be put in place to make that happen? And let's change things. Let's move towards an economy that isn't growing at 2% per year, but is growing at 5 or 7% per year, which should be imminently possible for an economy of Pakistan's size and potential and endowments. And so, from my perspective, what the exact contents of that reform program are really up to government. That is a choice for Pakistan to make. Of course, we have some ideas. And I think these ideas are not new. These are the ideas that people have been kicking around for a very long time. And I'll just race through them very quickly because I think they have been talked about a lot. Firstly, we've got to sort out the fiscal situation. We've got these long-term structural fiscal deficits. We've been running primary deficits even for a long time. So for your listeners, obviously, that means the deficit even before the costs of servicing your debt are taken into account. So even before you start to meet your interest costs, you've been running a deficit. You've been spending more than you're bringing in, even before those interest payments. And that's a real problem because that means that Pakistan is in a hole, 80% roughly of GDP in debt, and it's keeping on digging. It's continuing to dig that hole for as long as it has that primary deficit. Now, what we need to do is not just stop digging, but we need to start climbing out of that hole. And the only way you do that is by starting to run significant primary surpluses, right? You need to really close that fiscal gap. You need to bring in more revenue, and you need to get better at how you're spending so that you're generating growth rather than just generating consumption. And so specifics, I mean, look, we're still in a context where a third of GST revenue is given away in tax exemptions. Right? We're still in a context where Pakistan is achieving negligible revenues from taxes on real estate, taxes on agricultural production. We're still in a situation where government is spending money on energy subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, wheat subsidies. These kinds of expenditure and revenue systems, it's really benefiting the well-off at the expense of the average Pakistani and at the expense of long-term growth. So I think these overdue reforms that people have been talking about for a long time, people like you know very well the kinds of things that need to happen on the fiscal front. This is the opportunity to put some of those in place. So that's the fiscal. I think beyond that, there's a business environment context here as well. Pakistan remains a very difficult place to do business. Cutting some of the red tape, getting rid of some of the 40 regulatory agencies that businesses have to deal with on a day-to-day basis at the provincial level, making sure that those processes are easy to manage for business people, that they're not an additional tax on businesses. That's critically important. And another part of this that's important is the role that the state is playing in the economy. We have more than 200 state-owned enterprises even at the federal level, probably about the same number at the provincial level. The assets of those state-owned enterprises at the federal level, about 45% of GDP. So this is an enormous amount of the economy dominated by the public sector, right? And these SOEs are operating in cement, they're operating in construction, they're operating in transport, they're operating in energy, all of these sectors in which the private sector really could come in, operate much more efficiently, much more effectively, and alongside that, actually reduce some of the fiscal costs that the government is now facing in subsidizing these state-owned enterprises that are running long-term losses. So number one, fiscal. Number two, the business environment. Ease the business environment, make it easy to do business, get the state out of some of these sectors where it's really competing with the private sector rather than focusing on the core business of government. And then I think the third area really would be thinking about some of these longer term challenges around trade reform, removing some of the tariff barriers that are really creating constraints to Pakistan integrating into the global economy. We still have exports of 10% of GDP, while we're importing about 20% of GDP. so many countries have shown, so many fast-growing countries around the world have shown that if you can integrate into global supply chains, if you can access global export markets, that is the fastest way to productivity growth, economic growth, employment creation. You're not going to do that when you have an average effective tariff rate of 20%, right? So Pakistan needs to get out of the past. It needs to reduce some of these protectionist measures, which frankly just have been proven now not to work. And it has to think about how to integrate its production with the global economy. We have to address some of these constraints to human capital. So I think we have it's very hard for an economy to grow when your stunting rate is so high, when your educational attainment rates are so low, when access to clean water is so limited. And I think to get to some of those service delivery issues, we need to have a bit of a careful look at the current fiscal federalism arrangements, the way that the federal government is working with the provinces, is working with local government. Obviously, that's a long-term agenda. I mean, I think the fiscal needs to come first. Some of these longer-term issues, they're going to take years of reform. But if a government came in now, gave a clear signal that it was going to work on these issues, gave a clear signal that it had a plan for addressing some of these long-term constraints, what you would see is an immediate impact on confidence, an immediate impact on investment, and that would bring immediate benefits to the economy, even if those reforms are going to take some time to implement.
Yeah, I think the most important point that you made, right, and I 200% agree with, is coming out with a reforms view that you own and that's yours. Because, and I would say that has to be done even before you go to the spring meetings of the IMF to talk about the next tranche and the next program. Because if you're doing that proactive work, you already set the table and the negotiation in a very different context, right? Of saying, here's my agenda. And actually, you know what? My agenda is more ambitious, more sort of possible because I'm owning it than what you otherwise might have put, you being the IMF itself and my creditors, if I'm the Pakistani sovereign, putting myself in their shoes. That's a very different conversation to have with the international creditors that Pakistan has to deal with because of the debt problem you highlighted, versus going to them and saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that, I don't know what my own agenda is. And then they're going to impose things on you and you're not going to like it. And you're going to run into a lot of problems that you've seen in the past. So I wanted to underscore that particular point. I think the second thing that I wanted to underscore as well in terms of what you raised was, and this has come up on this podcast a lot. I was talking to Naveed Guraya, the Chief Investment Officer of Karandaz Capital, and he made a similar point to you, but his context was SME financing. And his point was like, look, if the sovereign is running perpetual fiscal deficits, it's crowding out borrowing. And if it's crowding out borrowing, I can't tell banks to not lend to the sovereign risk-free and go lend to somebody at a risk rate with high interest rates at the same time, because the sovereign is the enabler of this perpetual habit of the banking system, right? And I'm paraphrasing what he said. He was a lot more diplomatic than I am being, but essentially this is the point. And if the sovereign fixes that, then your point about the business environment, credit, supply chain integration, exports, producing things locally, all of that falls into place. But if the sovereign continues to say, hey, I'm going to run perpetual 5, 6, 7% fiscal deficits, good luck growing the private sector side of the economy in that context, right? Because of the just sheer chunk of liquidity the sovereign is sucking out of the system. So those are two, I think, important points I wanted to underscore. But I want to get to something else as well in terms of shift that we've seen in how the World Bank engages in Pakistan now. I think I grew up in my early years sort of studying economics, and even in other parts of the world, the World Bank sort of publishes research. It very quietly does its work and engages and funds things and sort of works with policymakers. And the goal is not to be sort of more as front and center. That's been the historical trend, at least that I've noticed. If I'm wrong on that, please correct me. But more recently, we've seen the World Bank be more in the limelight, so to speak, or be part of conversations more publicly and put its own thinking and research on the table a lot more aggressively, at least in the Pakistani context. What's the logic behind it? How did that come about? And how is that being received in a country like Pakistan, where, let's also be honest, Confessions of an Economic Hitman is a bestseller, and conspiracy theories of all sorts are the norm, not the exception. So share a bit about that strategic shift and how it's being received.
Yeah, no, it's been a very interesting experience. I mean, I think that our start point is that Pakistan is stuck, right? And I think that is, what do we mean by that? I mean, I think that anyone who just heard my long spiel about the reform priorities for Pakistan, who's been engaged in these conversations, has heard exactly these points being made 20, 30, 50, 100 times before at every conference, at every workshop, right? So what our feeling is that actually having the same conversation with the same group of actors, the same people that attend your regular policy workshops in Islamabad, we've been doing that a very long time, and we have a large degree of agreement, I would say, on at least what the core challenges are among that core group of educated technocrats, commentators who engage in these conversations. So it's not going to change if we keep doing that same thing. If we keep talking to the same people in the same way, that's not going to maximize our impact. So our thinking was that it's possibly useful for us to broaden this conversation. And that's what we've been trying to do over the past year or so. Is we've really been going out, we've been talking to universities, we've been trying to talk to youth groups, we've been talking to civil society, we've been having engagements across the provinces, we've been talking a lot to bring in minority voices or minority communities that are not normally part of this, with, as I say, a real emphasis on youth and using communication channels that are a bit unconventional for us and sometimes a bit uncomfortable for us, like social media, and using, for example, the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and Tabadla and some of our key partners to really just try and expand who we're talking to and bring in some semblance of an ecosystem of policy discussion that goes beyond the usual suspects, if you like. And our logic here, right, is that I think ultimately we're in a political equilibrium that does not want to change, right? This equilibrium is set. The reason that these economic policies are set is that they suit the interests of many of the people who are making those policies, who are setting those policies. So it's only by expanding the conversation and bringing more voices in that we might be able to shift that equilibrium, that we might be in a position where perhaps there's an increased demand, or at least a demand for different sectors of the population for things to change. So obviously it's not a system of us going out saying what we want people to think or saying what we want people to do. It's basically us trying to say, look, this is a very important conversation for Pakistan. How can we bring more people into that conversation so we hear what really the problems are for a broader range of people, the people that really are confronting these problems of limited employment opportunities, these people that are confronting limited access to services, in the hope that by having that conversation, we magnify the demand for change in some of these areas. So as I say, I mean, we've been doing a lot of outreach, a lot of activities. We've really been working to have different people speak at some of our events. We've been arranging the rooms differently so that we have some more women standing at the front, so that we have more women speaking first, so that we have younger people speaking. It's been a struggle, right? Because I think that some of these social dynamics are quite deeply embedded in every country. And I've got to say, I think the response has been generally very positive, right? I mean, I think that no one has told us this is not what we should be doing and we should get back in our lane. I think what the response more has been is people have been grateful to be asked what their opinions are about things in ways that they're normally on topics that they're normally not given a voice on. And I think that there is a broad perception that the system is stuck, even from the people within it, right? Yeah. I think this is a suboptimal equilibrium almost for everyone, even for the policymakers. Everybody knows that the way this economy is moving, the trajectory we are on, is not optimal for Pakistan's long-term future, but it's a collective action problem. So I think people are welcoming of any attempts that can be made to shift that equilibrium. But of course, there's still a diversity of views, as there always will be. And of course, people will disagree with some of the things we're saying. And that's just fine. That's what we want. We want discussion, not agreement. And I think it's been a pretty positive experience so far.
Yeah, I think again, I think the ecosystem approach perhaps is also part of the reason why this podcast exists. I remember talking to Musharraf, years ago. Now this is season 5, coming up on 200 episodes, and that was the idea, right? Like, would people be interested? The question was, would people be interested in listening to a podcast that sometimes is in English, sometimes is in Urdu, but primarily focuses on economy and political economy as a subset, but primarily tries to focus on that economic conversation. And the initial hypothesis was it would not be that broadly listened to, but yes, in the realm of what YouTube viewers are in Pakistan, it's still very small, but it's a big chunk and much bigger chunk than what we anticipated. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Hamza Haroon, who's currently running a campaign for NA46 in Islamabad, and running as an independent young candidate. And he's been going around on the peripheries of the outside of the core elite parts of Islamabad, engaging with his constituents. And he's like, they talk about things like, why isn't my alleyway being cleaned up? And why is there the impact of smog or access to mass transit, right? And again, those are things that the World Bank, not only in Pakistan, but around the world, has done a lot of good research on how to make that possible. Like alley cleaning and picking up trash is a local government problem. That's the macro policy thing, right? But it connects deeply with that constituent in a small alleyway outside of Islamabad who says, you know what, I should be able to I don't have to go to a bureaucrat running the Islamabad government, but I should be able to go to the city councillor living right there with me because he comes from this area, who's going to clean up my alleyway. And I think that the more that happens, the more this, constituency for change will be empowered, because that's where we need to go. So I really like that approach that you're taking, and as you elaborated on where things are going. I want to also talk a bit about sort of how you see the broader impact of the World Bank, right? And I'll give you a more critical example from my own thinking. I grew up reading the way I got into focused on economy is I used to read a lot about the economy in Dawn, and Dawn still, I think, maybe does. I read it mostly online now. Has I think every Tuesday or Wednesday would have the special business section, which would be in a brown color insert in the paper, and there would be stories. And I vividly remember every few years, and still happens, there would be a new World Bank program given to build capacity at the FBR. And my dad has a business, and we would always laugh and be like, FBR, the program, FBR doesn't really do its job. We're still talking about Shamshad Akhtar trying to shake it up and change the FBR, and we're still here years later. But that's an example of where I would say perhaps the World Bank hasn't had the intended success of its interventions, but there are other places where a lot of success has been delivered in terms of the World Bank's interventions or things that it has funded. So from your point of view, again, this is the question is more related to engaging with the audience and making them aware of the fact of what the impact of the World Bank is. What are some things that you and the team and the whole organization at World Bank in Pakistan is most proud of, and when it looks back at this long history in Pakistan and says, here are some things that the public ought to know, that we actually worked with stakeholders in Pakistan to deliver a positive and meaningful impact to the people?
Yeah. No, look, I mean, I'm replying to this as the current task team leader for Pakistan Raises Revenue, which is our FBR project at the moment. And the tax to GDP ratio is still at 10% of GDP, and it has been for 20 years. So, I mean, I think this is a really good question. And I think it's a question that needs to be asked of us. And I think it's a question that needs to be asked of the government as well. I think the impact of development agencies, the impact of the World Bank, but development in general is quite hard to nail down and attribute. There are some activities, there are some projects that do have a very direct and measurable impact. And, to give some examples of that, I mean, the BISP program, the Benazir Income Support Program, now obviously a government program, but the World Bank was in the kitchen with that from the beginning. We were helping design the program. We were helping design the targeting. It's still very reliant on the surveys that the World Bank provides the technical assistance for, the targeting mechanisms. And as a result of that, we have been able to now reach roughly 20% of the population, and that's having a sustained, measurable impact on people's welfare, especially those we target most, which is those at the bottom of the income distribution. I think you could also look at some of the work that was done recently by the Board of Investment on business environment reforms, where we saw that Pakistan actually made huge progress in simplifying some of the processes around, for example, business licensing or obtaining construction permits, quite technical things, quite process heavy things, but things that really matter for business people, things that really matter for people who are trying to create employment and grow their businesses. And then I think you've seen over COVID-19 and the floods, you've seen the World Bank come in with really quite substantial support, over $1.5 billion for the floods response. And that kind of immediate support really has helped the government implement its response plans. It's provided financing in context where there really wasn't a lot of fiscal space. And it's allowed the government to roll out the response that overall, I think in both of those cases is generally regarded to be maybe imperfect, but generally regarded to have been quite effective. And it has been World Bank support, World Bank advice, World Bank financing that has played a role in all of that. I think beyond that, I mean, there is also a role to be played by the World Bank and aid agencies and just providing the analysis, providing the commentary, saying what our view on what's happening on the economy is, giving our view on what the reform priority should be, because that fosters the kind of policy discussion that I think can lead to the kind of change that's needed. But ultimately, where I would come down on this is to say that development is a partnership. It's a partnership between a government and its development partners. That's why we're called partners, right? And I think in those cases where we have seen success, it's where the government has laid out an agenda and the development partners have mobilized behind that agenda, and we've achieved results. So the flood response, COVID-19, with this, in all of those cases, we really saw the government giving the lead, setting the agenda, and then the development partners able to mobilize assistance and resource behind that agenda. In a context like FBR, now look, we can support the systems, we can support the system improvements, we can build capacity of staff, we can provide training, we can provide IT systems. But if you're still giving away a third of your GST revenue a year in tax exemptions, if you're still not doing anything to simplify an amazingly complex personal income tax structure, if you're still not taxing property revenue, there's only so much you can do at that outcome level. So, the way I think of it is it's like we're helping them maintain the bicycle, right? We're oiling the chain for them. We're helping them pump up the tires. We're giving it a nice polish. But unless the bike is going to be ridden, then you're not going to get anywhere, right? So I think that's the constraint. If we have, it comes back to the point you were originally making. If we get to the point now where the government decides it does want to break out of the patterns of the past, if we do want to move to a structural change, and the government comes to us with a plan, we're not going to sit there and say, look, we don't like that plan, we don't agree with it, we're not going to support you. We're not, I think that those days of the multilateral agencies being doctrinaire or dogmatic, I think things have really changed since then. I think we look for a credible plan. We accept that there's diversity in the way that countries achieve economic growth. We want to see that plan, and then we can mobilize behind it. So, that's how I would think about this, right? It's not so much what's the World Bank done. It's where we have been and where are the opportunities where the World Bank can support a government agenda, because it's only when you get that alignment that you can achieve real results.
Well, first up, I would say there's something with World Bank economists and bicycles, because Gonzalo would always frame things around bicycles in his trade examples, and you just did the same. So I just wanted to flag that. Gonzalo, if you're listening, here's another bicycle lover from the World Bank. No, but I think, again, as you were explaining that, right, I think the juxtaposition I would put is the Benazir Income Support Program slash SAS, as it became under the last government, the PTI government. And I remember when the program was first launched, the PMLN in particular used to, diss on the plan, say this handout doesn't do anything. And then they came into power and they took it to the next level. And then the PTI also was sort of on the fence about it, if not critical. But then they came to power, they took it to an even bigger level with Dr. Sania Nishtar and her vision of expanding that umbrella, right? Linking it to girls' education and things like that. And to me, that stood out as a thing of saying, when, as you, in your analogy, if the rider wants to ride that bike, they might not like the exact makeup of the gear or the way the oiling is done, but when they get on it, they're going to pedal faster than their last one because they see the value in that. Whereas in taxes, it's that policy ownership gap that still exists. And my view is, again, if a government comes down and says, this is what my ambition and aspiration is in terms of shaking up the system or achieving some public good goals that I am setting out, and I'm going to own this, the partner can then that much easily get behind solar rooftop plan or mass transit plan or name your thing. And, that makes it that much easier as opposed to someone giving you the prescription, because you're never going to we don't like when the doctor says you have to take that tablet, right? Unless you make that choice of saying, I want to change my lifestyle and this medicine is good for me. So I think that's very, very important. The last question I had was, again, as you mentioned, being a bit more vocal about the World Bank's own commentary about what's going on with the economy and where things are going or ought to be going. There's still this question in Pakistan, mainstream in particular, less so in the more econ-oriented folks that understand the dynamics, about how close Pakistan was to the brink last year or last summer, and how, still the broader situation is still not that good in terms of external debt servicing needs, 80 to 90 billion over the next 3 years. From your point of view as an economist and looking at Pakistan, just help the viewer understand from your expert point of view how close things got last summer. And again, make them understand the risk of repeating the same mistakes again and what that would mean for the economy. Because in my conversation still, even this is true on the political side, find that a lot of people, majority in my view, do not appreciate how important it is to have a credible, perhaps even boring finance minister in charge of the country, right? The example I give is, I was talking to somebody last week, and they were like, oh, what happened to the last IMF tranche and the review? Did that even happen, or is Pakistan out of it? And I was telling them, no, it happened. And you know what? The fact that it happened in a way that you don't know about it is evidence that Dr. Shamshad Akhtar is doing a fantastic job at managing this program, because it shouldn't be in the headlines. You shouldn't be worried about things like this, right? This is the finance minister should just do it below the radar and it happens quietly. So help the listener understand from your point of view how close Pakistan was to the brink and what the costs perhaps might be of repeating those same mistakes that we've seen in the last couple of years or so.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. I mean, essentially, we were starting to recover from COVID, and we were hit by the floods, and the response to that shock of the floods was, I think, ultimately very counterproductive and quite dangerous overall. We had a situation where the exchange rate was being manipulated, and what that means essentially is that you're subsidizing imports and you're taxing exports, and that means that the difference between your imports and your exports is going to grow, and the way that you have to finance that at the end of the day is through your foreign exchange reserves, because you have to pay for your imports and you're not getting enough exports to pay for that. So the difference comes out of your foreign exchange reserves. And those foreign exchange reserves started to drop extremely quickly. So we ended up, I think, the low point was around 0.5, 0.6 months of import cover, where as a very rough guideline, countries should be retaining at least 4 months of import cover. And that means you're literally going to run out of foreign exchange reserves in a couple of weeks. That's not a position where any country wants to be in. So that manipulation of the exchange rate, I think, was very difficult. It sent all the wrong signals to markets. And no one is going to lend to a country or roll over its debt to a country that is about to run out of foreign exchange reserves, because that means you're not going to get paid back. So that policy on the external side was really a risk also to fiscal, and really this risk of a default was very real. On the fiscal side as well, we had this very pronounced fiscal deficit that was driven by unsustainable energy subsidies, very large unsustainable energy subsidies that overwhelmingly benefited the better off. A large proportion of the fiscal deficit was being financed through borrowing, but also through the open market operations, which were essentially the central bank injecting money into the economy in a way that's almost certain to generate high levels of inflation. So you saw inflation going up as well. And as a result of that, you saw this depreciation of the currency. So you had almost a perfect storm. You had an external crisis. You had a fiscal crisis that was at risk of turning into a debt crisis or a complete default. And you had a confidence crisis. You had the private sector looking at this and saying, this is not a viable economy. This is not an economy where I'm going to sink money into. So you saw the investment rate collapse. And you saw people trying to move their money overseas, which exacerbated the foreign exchange situation. If there had not been a course correction, I have absolutely no doubt Pakistan would have defaulted. I mean, it's mechanical, right? If you're at 0.6 months of import cover and you're continuing to run a large current account deficit and a large fiscal deficit, there's only one way you're going to go, and that's off the cliff. So I mean, I think that's the point for the listeners to understand, is that under those current policy settings, Pakistan was heading for the cliff. What I would say, though, is that it was never inevitable. It was always a policy decision whether Pakistan was going to hit that cliff or whether it was going to pull away. And what happened is, as we all know, right, we got to the point where there was some compromise on the IMF side. The EFF was dropped. We moved to the new SBA program, and government did the basics. It got the basics in place. It closed the fiscal deficit. It allowed the exchange rate to adjust, and we saw some resumption in confidence, and we saw some recovery in the foreign exchange reserves and investment. And I think what's critical here is the IMF, right? And the IMF is important, obviously, because it brings money. But much more than that, it unlocks the external financing from the bilateral partners. It allows a sense of confidence in the economy that the IMF has given it a rubber stamp, that things are moving in the right direction or are at least stable enough for an IMF program. And that, I think, is the real impetus, right? That's really what turned things around, or at least moved us towards a more stable trajectory. I want to be clear, though, right? I think that what happened when we got back on the IMF program really was it was a stabilization. It was doing the least possible to avoid going off the cliff. But I don't think anyone thinks that these underlying problems have really been fixed, right? We still have these structural problems. We still have, we're paying 7% of GDP in interest payments when total revenues are 10% of GDP. How can a country survive like this? We're still struggling with a structural current account deficit. I mean, they've managed to balance that over recent months, but firms are unable to repatriate their profits. Still, I think this constant risk of import controls being reimposed. So we're doing the minimum possible to avoid going off a cliff. And I'm really glad we're not going off a cliff, but no one should be under the illusion that the hard work is finished. This is really the point at which Pakistan needs to say enough, and enough of constantly being on the brink. Let's address some of these underlying constraints so that we can achieve the potential of the economy. So we're not the economy that's always in the emergency room, but we're one of the economy that's moving ahead, that's making life better for its citizens. And that is eminently achievable if we take this opportunity now to do a reset and to implement some of these reforms that we've been talking about that frankly everybody knows needs to happen, and we just need to get the collective will together to push them through.
Yeah, I think the emergency room analogy you used is my favorite one, and I often compare it to having a senior member of your family who's a diabetic. And if that diabetic is addicted to eating gulab jamuns or laddus or their favorite chocolates every single time, they're going to end up in the ER. When they're in the ER or the ICU, the doctor gives them insulin and keeps them under observation. But that's no way to live for a diabetic. And if every time they're out of that ER or they get discharged by the doctor after a shot of insulin, and then they go back to the sweets shop and eat a kilo of gulab jamun again, you're going to get gangrene. And when you're going to get gangrene and the doctor cuts your arm off to save your life, you can't complain to the doctor and say, dude, what happened to my hand? Like, you had gangrene, right? And I think that that's the whole issue in terms of, we've seen this cycle repeat in Pakistan, that you enter the ICU, which is the IMF. You sort of do the bare minimum to get out of it, mostly unsuccessfully. There's only been one successful program in Pakistan's history. And then you go back to the bad habits. And then you complain that, things are not working. And I'm like, you got to break out of the cycle in 2024, is I think we both agree on that. And we can end this conversation on that note. But before I let you go, this question: what are a couple of books you would recommend to the audience?
Look, I mean, it's such a hard question, but I think one book that I love is Violence and Social Order by Douglas North, and a couple of his co-authors. But I think that's just such an important book for anyone interested in development, because really what it lays out is the interaction between politics and economics in an incredibly powerful way. And the basic argument of that book is that economic institutions in developing countries, in most countries in the world, aren't primarily about economic efficiency. They're about holding together elite bargains. They're about making sure that everybody gets their share. And the way you get development is by moving that elite bargain gradually to a point where everybody gets their share, but things are slightly more efficient, slightly more effective, they're slightly less wasteful. And I think that book gives a framework really to understand what's happening in countries like Pakistan, how the politics interacts with the economics, but also gives a bit of a prescription about how those things can change over time, and why we need to kind of work a little bit with the politics rather than just always be coming in with kind of standardized cookie cutter reforms and cookie cutter approaches. So a wonderful book, and it really kind of changed the way I thought about development. The other one I was going to mention was The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, which I just think is it's a fantastic read. It's obviously it's a history book. It's about the East India Company and its rule over the subcontinent, and it's just a rollicking read, right? It's really interesting, but also I just think it's shocking in terms of the rapaciousness and the complete extraction that took place. And I think that gives us a really important foundation for understanding some of the deeper roots of the process of development in the subcontinent. And I think it's a perfect counter to those who defend colonialism or try and say that experience was somehow positive for the country's experience in colonial rule, because it is it's a very disturbing book in lots of ways, but I think it really helps us understand the past that we're trying to overcome to this day in some ways.
Yeah, The Anarchy is fantastic read. I think his other books are also must reads. Return of a King on Afghanistan is brilliant. And for those of you who perhaps like listening to podcasts as opposed to reading books, the Empire seasons that he's done. Exactly. The first season is on India and colonial India. And that's, if you want to skip the book and listen to that, if that's your preference, that serves the same purpose. And again, right, the defense of colonialism, right? I always joke with people who try to have this conversation. I'm like, that's like me saying I lost 20 pounds by starving myself. That's not success. Like, that's not a great diet plan to follow. Like, how can you say my success is 20 pounds lost by starving? Like, I'll have long-term health implications of that strategy. Like, stupid to argue that point, but some people still do. And I think that's a bit crazy. So yes, read that book if you have that view. It'll make you rethink what colonialism was like in the subcontinent. But Tobias, thank you so much for your time, for the work that you do and the research. Pleasure talking to you. And again, perhaps we'll have you back on with, sharing your view on what the reforms agenda of the new government looks like. Hopefully, they follow what you and I and many others have been saying: take ownership, shake up the tree, and take the lead in terms of what you want for the country itself, because that's the best way to move forward at this point in time. So, thank you so much.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much.